I'm Richard White, Commercial Director at Oxfam PharmaGenesis. I'm going to be talking today about the ISMPP annual meeting. A little bit of background on Oxfam PharmaGenesis. We are the health science communicators. We're an independent consultancy. We have offices in the UK, the US, and in Switzerland. We won the Queen's Award for Enterprise last year. About 50% of our global business is in the publications area, and so we're regular attendees of ISMPP and TIPA and similar meetings. My background is in pharmacology. I also have some training in health economics and marketing. I'm currently an honorary research fellow at Oxford Brookes University. I've been on faculty at several ISMPP and TIPA meetings and was in attendance at this year's meeting. ISMPP this year was the largest annual meeting to date, more than 500 attendees from over 10 countries. It was at a new venue this year, which was the Gaylord Centre in National Harbour, which was a departure, I think, from previous ISMPPs in that it was a much larger conference centre. I think reflected that the meetings become much larger. There's a considerable faculty and a good mix of plenary presentations, panel discussions, lots of posters, 45 submitted posters, so a lot more engagement with the organisation on research, and it felt like a great meeting in terms of the collaboration among academia, industry and medical communications area. I'll just go through the key topics that emerged at the meeting. I've listed them there. A lot of it was about transparency, which is the key theme of the meeting. The ICMG proposal for data sharing, a rather interesting and provocative panel discussion on whether the medical journal model is still fit for purpose, alternative metrics to the impact factor, social media, and publications in some wider areas such as real-world evidence, health economics outcomes research, and rare diseases. First keynote was by Jenny Sykes, who's Vice President of Global Medical Platforms at GSK. And she summarised some of the principles of transparency, but made the point that expectations are not really being met in terms of timely access to clinical data by the current publishing model, particularly in an era of social media. She did refer to some of the recent publications criticising the industry for slow publication of data or lack of transparency, with an analysis that she presented over 5 years of GSK publications. And with their own studies, they showed that more than 90% of all the studies completed over 5 years had actually been submitted for publication. And she was at pains to show that there was no real difference between negative and positive studies, because often one of the criticisms, of course, is that only positive studies are published. And that about 70% of all the completed studies have been published successfully, and again, no real difference between the negative and the positive studies. Jenny pointed out that GSK is currently the only pharma company signed up to all trials, and that GSK established clinicalstudydatarequest.com, which is this online repository that enables people to access anonymised patient data, and that this has now been joined by 12 other companies. This process involves researchers submitting research proposals, which are then reviewed by an independent panel, which is the Wellcome Trust. And she showed the latest data, which is that of 136 proposals that have met the requirements for submission, 123 have been accepted. So really there seems to be no barrier to accessing these data, provided that the submission is appropriate. She referred also to the process that other companies have in place. The Janssen companies have their Yoda process, and did suggest that the ideal would be full data sharing, and there's a quote there that this would be patient-centric, wouldn't be affected by commercial interest. And one thing we noted there was that there's no concern really over potential re-identification of anonymised data, and that's something we'll come back to. Related to this topic was then a panel discussion on the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors proposal on data sharing. This involved representatives from ICMG, also pharma, industry and academia. There's a bit of background to why ICMG have done this, and it's stimulated by a recent IOM report and by the EU disclosure requirements. They mentioned that hundreds of comments have been received on this proposal. All will be reviewed, and so the process of finalising their policy is probably going to take at least 6 months. The panel discussion and opening up to Q&A to the audience, very interesting. I identified quite a few issues that are relevant to the proposal. One that was mentioned from particularly the industry perspective was IP, that if early phase data are disclosed, that could create prior art that meant the company then couldn't obtain a subsequent patent. The risk of re-identification of patients was brought up here. One of the industry speakers noted that that could actually be something that pharma could be held responsible for as the study sponsor, and so was an area of concern. Some concern over whether people reanalyzing data are actually qualified to do it, and the suggestion that ICMG came back with was that ideally original researchers should be involved in any subsequent reanalyses of their data. The fact that there are multiple data repositories already, and ideally you'd rather have a single source, and a question over how this will be policed. If people don't do what ICMG is suggesting and don't post their data within 6 months of a publication, what will happen? Will the publication be retracted? There's some lack of clarity over whether it will be policed and how. Oxfam Genesis has put together a comment on the ICMG proposal under the heading "Time to put the patient first," because what we feel here, there's a lot of interest here from publishers, there's a lot of interest from industry, but actually there's been very little, I think, heed taken of the people whose data will actually be shared here, which is the patients who are involved with the trials. We've submitted a comment here, and there's a link to it on this slide, that sets out essentially what we believe in terms of public access to patient data, the risk of re-identification, whether informed consent actually takes into account what could happen to patients' data, and some recommendations for action by ICMG. So we'll look forward to the response and how the ICMG proposal potentially changes as a result. The second keynote on day 2 was by Richard Smith, who's a former editor of BMJ. And his was quite a provocative talk. It's about medical journals. Is it time for something different? He started off by ranking journals out of 10 for various aspects of things that journals should do and what they actually do. At the top, 10 out of 10 was making money. To be fair, providing jobs and agenda setting were other things he felt journals did well. In terms of things they do okay, but could do better, to mention promoting drugs of pharma companies, leadership, promoting science and education, probably there's room for improvement there. So most noticeable, I think, is things he felt journals do very badly. Entertaining the reader, certainly one, but quality assurance of the science, organising, curating the mass of knowledge, isn't really done by journals, and to really provide a reference that gives you everything you need, as opposed to everything a journal is interested in. He pointed out lots of issues with the current journal model and the ways in which he feels it's deeply flawed. The main one is that the process is not transparent. It doesn't really assure the quality of the data, so it doesn't get rid of fraud, doesn't eliminate publication bias, it doesn't obviate pointless research, and that it's very slow. It typically takes at least months, sometimes years, for data to get out there through the current model. So those were all the criticisms. The potential solutions were fairly radical. Richard's solution was that any study should be justified by an open process based first on a systematic literature review. So before you do any study, first check that no one else has done it, or what the results were if they did, and show that it's adding something new. There'd then be broad consultation, publication of a protocol. The publication itself wouldn't be the current 3,000 word summary, it'd be something much larger, something open access, in detail, with disclosure of the source data, which would be de-identified. And then there'd be critical assessment by wider input from society and not just a closed peer review process. Fairly radical stuff. Not surprisingly, there were questions from the floor. The main ones that I've highlighted here is, where would this leave journals? Richard's comment was that the journals could have a role close to that of current mass media, which is that they're not really disseminating the data but commenting on it, raising issues, campaigning and such like. And of course, from an ISMPP perspective, where would this leave the medical publication professional? Richard's response to that was that they would still have a role working with researchers to communicate the data, because there's still a need for high quality writing, clear and engaging language, and actually organising and curating the data. So certainly some food for thought from Richard there. Another area that I think was quite prominent at ISMPP this year was alternative metrics. The impact factor has been around for a long time in terms of a ranking of journals, and it is a ranking of journals, but often used, unfortunately, as a ranking of articles. But there's now some new alternative metrics. Altmetric and Plum Analytics are the two most well-known sources of alternative metrics data. There's an interesting presentation by Pfizer, who have actually been reviewing alternative metrics across all their products and franchises over the last couple of years. That's 400 articles worth of data. It was a very interesting poster. I think the key results that emerged from that is that it's actually rather hard to interpret what the metrics themselves mean. And what's more interesting is the qualitative responses. It's who's tweeting, who's interested. It's going into that level of detail rather than necessarily the volume. The other issue, of course, is that we don't really know how to interpret the numbers from an altmetric score. There was a presentation by the NiceSo group, which is a not-for-profit organisation that's involved with technical standards for information distribution. This is things like DOI numbers, ISBN, they're involved with these areas. And they're developing technical standards for these new forms to assess publications in terms of how they're used, how they're calculated, the transparency and reliability of these. They have draft standards expected in a couple of months, and there's a final publication tentatively planned for next year. And there's a link here up on the slide to that process. That'd be rather interesting, of course, in determining what these metrics mean and how they can be used going forward. I guess related to impact is social media and enhanced journal content. What was presented was essentially healthcare professionals are still selective in terms of their use of social media. They prefer to obtain information, particularly on clinical trials, from what you call, I guess, traditional sources, printed material, industry websites. And there's a lot of suspicion over whether information that comes through social media is actually robust. When it comes to communities on social media, physicians tend to prefer restricted online communities, things like Sermo and Doximity, not really so much Facebook and Twitter. There were some survey results presented around this area. Pharma industry is certainly still wary of social media. A couple of companies presented their policies or elements of their policies on social media communication, and this is where a journal has asked them perhaps to provide some social media content on an article, on a study they've sponsored. This is fairly narrow in terms of what they do, so they stay within the scope of the publication. There's typically no additional interpretation of the results beyond what's already in the paper, no identifiable patient information, and full disclosure of what the company has done. And most of the concerns surround the fact that scientific publications are an accepted safe harbour for scientific exchange, but things like Facebook and Twitter are not. And as soon as someone starts to post comments on your study and people start to reply to it, you have a lack of control over dissemination of information, where the discussion goes, and there's quite a strong risk of inadvertent promotion to patients. So a lot of distrust of social media. That said, there's a lot of interest in going behind traditional journal content. Rich media content and augmented reality are things that are now being trialled by pharma companies. These have been around for a long time, and pharma's never an industry to leap in first with any sort of new technology, but there is evidence, certainly from the ISMPP meeting, that they're starting to engage with it. Some of the journals presented what they're doing, things like the NAGM Quick Take, which is a multimedia video representation of studies, and also associated media such as slide decks, interactive elements, audio interviews. And augmented reality, this was again something that a couple of companies presented. The augmented reality concept is similar to QR codes in the sense that you use a mobile device to scan a poster, and on your screen comes some additional content, and it can be used for things like audio or video abstracts, mechanism of action videos, or additional tables and figures. And companies are actually trying this. One of the approaches that's been used is the Blipar app, and that has some interesting possibilities in terms of what you could do, particularly around a poster, providing that the conference has adequate Wi-Fi, and that was given as a big caveat with all of these things. Going on to the workshops, the key themes included areas, I guess, beyond traditional clinical trial publications. Oxfam PharmaGenesis, we're very pleased that our ISMPP University webinar on real-world evidence publications was voted the best ISMPP year of 2015, so we were invited up to reprise that. But there was a lot of interest in general, I think, in workshops in that area, and roundtables also in things like HOR, rare diseases, biosimilar publications and such like. Just finally, other themes that not covered in any detail here, but I think they'll probably increase in prominence in future ISMPP meetings. Incorporating the patient voice into publications, certainly one thing that came up, how they're involved with the clinical trial process, but also in the development of publications themselves. Disclosure of transfers of value always comes up at these publications meetings. One advance that I've seen at ISMPP that I hadn't seen previously is something called the Convey system, which has been set up by the Association of American Medical Colleges, which is the first place where an individual such as a clinical researcher can post all of their declarations, and so journals can then access that when they want to understand what a person's declarations are, rather than the author having to fill in a different form every time for a different journal. So that may lead to some efficiencies, I think, in the submission process and in the declaration process. And finally, predatory journals, which always pop up at these publications planning meetings, but they are certainly becoming very prominent, particularly in India and Asian countries. And there's some good advice on how to spot these journals and what to do potentially if you do spot them. So some areas for future interest there, I think. Thank you very much for your attention.